The quiet Midwestern diner buzzed with Sunday lunch chatter as David, across the worn Formica, announced, "I'm leaving you, Sarah." His words, delivered with a casual shrug, cut through the clamor, leaving her exposed, a forgotten coffee cup halfway to her lips. Then he added, "You're still young. You need a reliable man, and I'm not him." The hum of the refrigerator often seemed louder than any conversation between Sarah and David. She watched him across the supper table, his fork systematically pushing green beans onto a piece of pork chop. 12 years had passed since they'd first met, a blur of ordinary days that had somehow congealed into this quiet, predictable present. She felt them suspended, just here, in the muted light of their dining room, the air thick with unspoken things. She remembered the swiftness of it all. Econ 101, a shared glance over supply and demand curves. He'd been charming then, eager, full of a quiet ambition that had drawn her in. They were over the moon, people said, and it had felt true. A dizzying rush from first date to shared apartment, then a small house with a yard. Sarah used to pride herself on their stable and drama-free life, a stark contrast to some of her friends' more tumultuous relationships. But stability had, over time, curdled into something else. It was stale now. Like bread left too long on the counter, their days had become a well-worn path. Wake up. The alarm, a low buzz at 6. David left for the plant by 7. Sarah taught 3rd grade, the cheerful chaos of children, a stark contrast to the quiet of her evenings. She'd come home, make dinner, they'd eat, watch the local news, maybe a sitcom. He'd fall asleep on the sofa, she'd read for a bit, then they'd head to bed. The ritual familiar, almost comforting in its lack of surprise. The passion and excitement of those early days, the spontaneous weekend trips, the late-night talks that lasted until dawn, were a distant echo now, faint and barely discernible. Then the invitation arrived. A heavy cardstock, cream-colored, with elegant script announcing Amy's engagement party. Amy, her old college roommate, a whirlwind of laughter and impulsive decisions. A flutter of excitement, unexpected and sharp, moved through Sarah. It had been years since she'd seen most of that crowd. A chance to revisit a more carefree time. A version of herself she hadn't thought about in years. She found herself at the mall the following Saturday, something she rarely did without a specific purpose. She wandered into a boutique, a place she usually only glanced at through the window. A dress, a slinky black number with a modest neckline, caught her eye. It was daring for her. Not the practical A-line she usually favored. She tried it on, turning in the dressing room mirror, surprised by the way the fabric clung, the way it moved when she walked. She bought it. Later that week, she spent extra time on her hair and makeup, an uncharacteristic indulgence. She watched her reflection. A quiet yearning for something more. For herself to be more. Evident in the careful sweep of her eyeliner, David noticed. He looked up from his plate as she came into the dining room, dressed and ready. "You look beautiful, Sarah," he said, and his smile was warm, a genuine curve that reached his eyes. For a moment, a small, almost forgotten spark of their old chemistry flickered. A sense of connection, fleeting but real, passed between them across the familiar table. Sarah held on to that moment, a fragile hope blossoming in her chest. Maybe this party, this change of pace, was just what they needed. Maybe it could inject some life back into their relationship, a much-needed jolt to wake them from their long, quiet slumber. She hoped it could. The elevator doors hissed open, revealing a rush of sound and light. They stepped onto the rooftop, and the atmosphere was electric, a stark contrast to the quiet of their home. A swanky rooftop bar downtown, packed with people, music thrumming with a bass line that vibrated through the floor. Fairy lights draped overhead, reflecting off the polished glass and the shimmering city skyline. Sarah took it all in, the smell of expensive perfume mixing with something citrusy from the bar. "Wow, Amy really went all out," Sarah remarked, her voice a little louder than usual to cut through the din. She had to lean in to speak to David, who stood beside her, a hand resting lightly on her lower back. He nodded, scanning the crowd. "Yeah. Quite the shindig." His smile was polite, his gaze steady. He didn't seem as taken aback by the energy as she was, Perhaps more accustomed to large gatherings through his work, they maneuvered through the crowd, heading for the bar where a waiter offered them flutes of champagne. The bubbles tickled Sarah's nose. It felt good to be out. The clink of glasses, the murmur of dozens of conversations blending into a pleasant hum. They found a few familiar faces from their college days, exchanging quick hugs and catching up on superficial updates. Sarah found herself genuinely laughing, the kind of uninhibited sound that rarely escaped her at home. The monotony of daily life, the quiet expectations, began to melt away under the warm glow of the lights and the easy flow of conversation. She felt lighter, almost buoyant. After about an hour, the champagne and the circulating appetizers caught up with her. "I'm going to find the ladies' room," she told David, who was deep in conversation with a former fraternity brother. He gave a distracted nod, waving her off. She navigated through the festive crush, past groups of well-dressed people, until she found the discreet door marked with a silver silhouette. The restroom was surprisingly quiet. A brief respite from the party's energy. She checked her lipstick in the mirror, splashed a little cold water on her face, and ran her fingers through her hair, smoothing a few stray strands. As she washed her hands, the door behind her opened. "Sarah, oh my God, is it you?" The voice was low, familiar, yet startling. She turned, water still dripping from her fingertips. Scott Miller. He stood in the doorway, a broad, easy smile on his face. He looked as handsome as ever, maybe more so, with a maturity that suited him. His dark hair was a little shorter, neatly styled, and his eyes, a startling blue, held the same spark of intelligent humor she remembered. Scott and Sarah had dated briefly in college, a whirlwind 3 months that had ended amicably enough when his focus shifted to law school applications. His presence now brought a rush of memories flooding back. Late-night study sessions in the library, his arm around her at football games, the effortless way he could make her laugh. Scott. "Wow, it's been forever," she managed, a genuine surprise coloring her voice. She quickly dried her hands and reached out, giving him a quick, almost reflexive hug. He smelled faintly of a sophisticated cologne. He returned a dazzling smile, his grip firm on her shoulders for a moment longer than strictly necessary. "You look incredible, Sarah. Absolutely stunning. I almost didn't recognize you." His compliment was delivered with an easy charm, and she felt a blush creep up her neck, a sensation she hadn't experienced in years. They stepped out of the restroom, finding a quieter corner near a potted palm. They fell into easy conversation, a natural rhythm picking up as if no time had passed. They caught up on the past decade, filling in the gaps. Scott spoke of his successful career as a lawyer, a partner now at a prominent firm in Chicago. He'd traveled extensively, seen parts of the world Sarah had only read about. Then, almost casually, he mentioned his recent divorce, a quiet end to a marriage that hadn't quite worked out. He spoke without bitterness, more with a sense of reflective acceptance. As he talked, animated and engaging, Sarah felt a familiar flutter in her stomach, the same one she'd experienced all those years ago when he'd first looked at her across a crowded lecture hall. It was a dangerous, thrilling sensation, a subtle shift in the carefully constructed balance of her evening, and perhaps, of her life. Scott's eyes, those same intense blue eyes she remembered from her college days, twinkled mischievously. He leaned against the railing, a half-empty glass in his hand, a casual confidence about him. "So, are you here with anyone?" "Sarah?" The question was direct, unburdened by pleasantries. Sarah hesitated, the champagne making her feel a little bolder than usual. "Yes, actually. My husband David is here somewhere." The words felt heavy. A sudden anchor, a flicker of disappointment, quick as a blink, crossed Scott's face, instantly masked by his practiced charm. He nodded, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "Ah, the husband," he said, the tone light, almost dismissive. He pushed off the railing. "Well, it was great catching up, Sarah. Really good to see you." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "Maybe we could grab coffee sometime and chat more? Properly catch up, you know?" She knew she should politely decline, offer some vague excuse about being too busy, or simply thank him and walk away. But something, a restless yearning she couldn't quite name, made her nod instead. "Sure, Scott. That would be nice." The words were out before she could second-guess them. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that made her stomach do another quick flip. "Great. I'll get your number from Amy." Walking back into the main swell of the party, Sarah felt a potent mix of excitement and guilt swirling inside her. The excitement was sharp, almost giddy, a feeling of possibility she hadn't realized she missed. The guilt was a dull ache, a quiet accusation. She told herself it was harmless, just coffee with an old friend, a chance encounter, nothing more. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered that she knew there was more, that the simple act of agreeing held a weight, a small but significant shift. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of laughter with old friends and stolen glances with Scott across the room. She found David again, danced a slow song with him, trying to focus on his familiar scent, the solid weight of his hand on her back. He talked about a new project at work, his voice a low, steady drone against her ear. She nodded, smiled, but every time she caught sight of Scott, his head thrown back in laughter with someone else, her heart would race a little faster. She found herself gravitating towards Scott more and more, drawn by an invisible current. They talked about professors they'd both disliked, about the campus coffee shop, about dreams they'd had for their lives that hadn't quite panned out. They shared inside jokes from their brief time together, small memories only they would understand, and the laughter felt easy, unforced. They flirted in a way that towed the line of appropriateness, a comfortable banter that danced on the edge of something sharper. His hand brushed hers as he reached for a napkin, a touch that lingered for a fraction of a second too long. Sarah knew she was playing with fire, that there was a silent agreement between David and her, an unwritten rule she was subtly bending. But the thrill of it was intoxicating. She hadn't felt this alive, this desired, in years. The predictable rhythm of her life with David had dulled her senses, flattened her edges. The spark with Scott was exciting and new, a vivid, vibrant color in a world that had become shades of gray. It was a dangerous feeling. But for the first time in a long time, she felt awake. Around midnight, the party still in full swing but with a slightly softer hum, she excused herself to get some air. She found a quiet corner on the rooftop terrace, away from the pulsating music and the crowd. The cool night breeze felt good against her flushed cheeks, a clean, crisp sensation after the warmth and closeness of the party. She leaned against the railing, looking out at the city lights, the hum of distant traffic, a faint, constant drone. Footsteps crunched softly on the gravel of the rooftop terrace behind her. Sarah didn't need to turn to know who it was. The air shifted, thick with an unspoken current that had been building between them all evening. "Beautiful view," Scott said, his voice a low murmur as he came to stand beside her, his shoulder almost brushing hers. The tension between them was palpable, stretched thin like a wire, humming with electricity. He turned to her, the city lights reflecting in his eyes, making them seem even more intense. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice barely above the wind, "I know I shouldn't say this, but I've missed you all these years. I've wondered what might have been." His words hung in the cool night air, heavy and direct. Sarah swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat. "Scott, she started, trying to grasp for a coherent thought. A line to draw, a reason to pull back, but before she could finish, before the words could fully form, he leaned in. His hand gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing over her skin, sending a jolt through her. And then he kissed her. It was soft at first, tentative, a question more than a demand. For a moment, she was too shocked to react, her mind a blank, the taste of champagne and something minty on his breath. Then, to her shame, to the quiet horror that would settle in later, she found herself kissing him back. It was not a gentle kiss. It was passive and urgent all at once, years of pent-up desire, of unspoken longing, pouring out in that single, reckless moment. His arm went around her waist, pulling her closer, and the world narrowed to the feel of his lips, the press of his body against hers, the dizzying rush of finally succumbing. They were so caught up in the moment, lost in the sudden, desperate intimacy, that they didn't hear the terrace door open. They didn't hear the subtle shift in the air, the faint sound of movement, a sharp intake of breath, A sound that was less a gasp and more a punch of air snapped Sarah out of it. She pulled away from Scott, her head snapping up, her eyes wide. David. He was standing there, framed in the doorway, the light from inside casting him in stark relief. His face was a mask of shock and pain. His eyes, usually so placid, now wide and desolate. The world seemed to stop. The city lights blurred. The distant hum of traffic vanished. Sarah stared at David, her mind racing to find words. Any words, an explanation, an apology, a desperate plea, but nothing came out. Her throat was tight, choked by guilt, and a profound, sickening regret. The scene, cold and stark, was perfectly clear. Her, Scott, the undeniable intimacy, and David, watching it all. David didn't yell. He didn't cause a scene. There were no raised voices, no dramatic accusations. He simply looked at her, his eyes cold, empty, devoid of the warmth she had grown so accustomed to. Then, without a word, without a sound, he turned. His back stiff, his shoulders squared, he walked away, disappearing back into the party, leaving the terrace open and empty behind him. David. Wait. Sarah finally managed to call out, her voice a ragged whisper. But it was too late. He was already gone, swallowed by the crowd, by the pulsating music. She turned to Scott, her face undoubtedly pale, her breath coming in shallow gasps. I have to go, she stammered, the words tumbling out. She pushed past him, rushing after David, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. By the time she made it back inside, pushing through the indifferent partygoers, David had vanished. She searched frantically, her eyes scanning every face, every corner, but he was nowhere to be found. The reality of what had happened settled over her, cold and heavy. The energy of the party, once intoxicating, now felt oppressive, suffocating. Finally, her shoulders slumped, she pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she called a cab for home. The house was dark when Sarah arrived, the silence inside a heavy, tangible thing after the thrumming music and chatter of the party. Her cab had dropped her off at the curb, and she'd fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking. The porch light, usually left on for David, was off. She found him in the kitchen, sitting at the small, round oak table, the one they'd inherited from his grandmother. A single glass of whiskey sat in front of him, the amber liquid glinting under the dim light of the range hood. He didn't look up when she entered, didn't acknowledge her presence. But his stillness was a louder statement than any shout. The ice in his glass had long since melted. David, she began, her voice a thin, reedy sound, barely recognizable. It shook, unsteady. I'm so sorry. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness. It didn't mean anything, I swear. The words tumbled out, desperate and clumsy, tasting like ashes in her mouth. She stood a few feet from the table, not daring to approach, the distance between them feeling vast and unbridgeable. He remained silent, his gaze fixed on the surface of the dark liquid in his glass, as if it held all the answers to the universe. Or perhaps, all the pain. The silence stretched between them, heavy and oppressive, filled with the unspoken accusation hanging in the air. The faint hum of the refrigerator, usually a comfort, now felt like a taunt. Sarah stood there, her heart pounding against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that echoed in her ears. She waited for David to say something. Anything. A yell, a curse, a demand for explanation. But there was nothing, only his rigid silence. Please, she whispered, tears welling, blurring the already dim room. Talk to me, yell at me, do something. Her own quiet desperation felt like a scream trapped inside her chest. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, David looked up. The pain in his eyes was unbearable, raw and exposed, like an open wound. It was worse than any anger, any shout. It was a desolation that made her stomach clench. What do you want me to say, Sarah? He asked, his voice barely audible, flat and devoid of emotion. That it's okay? No, of course not, she sobbed, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. I know it's not okay. I made a terrible mistake, and I regret it more than anything, but we can work through this, can't we? Our marriage is stronger than one stupid moment, one stupid kiss. She clasped her hands together, a silent plea. David let out a bitter laugh, a harsh, humorless sound that scraped against the quiet. "Is it?" he asked, his voice gaining a hard edge. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty damn fragile." He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the kitchen floor. The sudden, jarring noise making Sarah flinch. He stood up abruptly, a tall, imposing shadow against the faint light. "I'm going to bed," he said flatly, his voice utterly drained. "I can't deal with this right now." He turned, his intention clear, to simply walk away, to retreat into the silence of their bedroom. As he brushed past her, Sarah reached out, her hand tentatively touching his arm, a desperate attempt to connect, to hold on to him. He flinched, jerking his arm away as if her touch burned him, as if she were poison. The rejection stung more than any words could have, a searing pain that pierced through her guilt and regret. He didn't look back, simply walked out of the kitchen, his footsteps fading as he ascended the stairs. The quiet click of their bedroom door closing echoed in the stillness. Sarah stood alone in the kitchen, the whiskey glass still on the table, a silent testament to the evening's unraveling. She sank onto a bar stool, the cold formica against her forearms, and spent the rest of the night on the couch, the rough fabric scratching at her skin. She replayed the events of the evening over and over, a relentless loop in her mind. Scott's kiss, David's face, the final, searing rejection. How could I have been so stupid? How could I have risked everything for a fleeting moment of something that felt like escape? The thought, heavy and bitter, settled deep in her gut. Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. The next few days were excruciating. The silence that had always been a quiet hum in their house now stretched into an unbearable roar. David barely spoke to me. He would wake before dawn, the muted sounds of him getting ready in the dark bedroom, a stark reminder of his deliberate distance. He'd leave for work early, before the first hint of light touched the sky. And he wouldn't return until long after I had eaten dinner alone, often after I'd already retreated to the living room couch. Our usual pattern, once so predictable, had splintered into fractured pieces. When we were in the same room, the tension was palpable. A thick, suffocating air that settled between us like a physical barrier. He moved through the house as if I weren't there, his eyes sliding past me, refusing to meet mine. The clink of his fork against his plate at breakfast, the rustle of his newspaper, the click of the lock when he left, each sound amplified, a testament to the chasm that had opened. I tried several times to initiate a conversation about what had happened. I knew we couldn't just let it fester. "David, can we just talk for a minute?" I'd ask, my voice small, fragile. My attempts were met with stone walls, an impenetrable silence. Each time, he shut me down. Once, I followed him to the garage as he grabbed his briefcase. "David, please, I just need to explain," I pleaded, my hand reaching out. Then hesitating, he turned, his face unreadable, devoid of the familiar warmth or even the anger I braced myself for. "I'm not ready to talk about it, Sarah," he'd say, his voice flat, emotionless, like he was reciting a line he'd practiced. He wouldn't raise his voice, wouldn't meet my gaze, just utter those words and walk away, leaving me standing in the silent kitchen, the ghost of his presence lingering. So I gave him time, trying to respect his need for space, even as every moment of that silence felt like a slow, agonizing suffocation. I felt like I was slowly suffocating under the unspoken weight of my actions, under the heavy blanket of his pain. Each hour felt like a day, each day, an eternity. The house, once a comforting sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The guilt was eating me alive. It gnawed at the edges of my thoughts, a constant, dull ache that intensified at night. I couldn't sleep. My mind raced, replaying every moment of that night, every casual flirtation, every shared glance, every intoxicating laugh, culminating in that one reckless kiss. I couldn't eat. Food tasted like sawdust, and the thought of it made my stomach churn. I felt hollowed out, a shell of myself. Every time I closed my eyes, David's face was there, stark and vivid. The moment he caught me with Scott, his mouth slightly agape, the light from the party glinting in his eyes, That cold, empty stare had become a haunting, indelible memory, seared into my mind. It was a silent judgment that followed me into every room, every thought, a constant reminder of the trust I had shattered, the hurt I had inflicted. It was a mirror reflecting not just his pain, but my own profound failure. A week after the party, a lifetime in its own way, Sarah came home from work. The afternoon sun slanted through the living room window, illuminating dust motes in the still air. She found David at the kitchen table, a stack of papers in front of him. Her stomach dropped like a stone as she recognized the letterhead of a local law firm, etched in crisp black ink. "What's this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, though she already knew the answer with a sickening certainty. David looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed but determined, stripped of their usual warmth. "I think we need to talk," he said quietly, his voice flat. Sarah sat down across from him, her legs feeling weak, a cold dread seeping into her bones. "Okay," she whispered. Resigned, he took a deep breath before speaking. "I've been doing a lot of thinking this past week. About us. About our marriage. About what happened at the party." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak, bracing for the inevitable pronouncement she felt hovering between them. "The thing is, Sarah," he continued, his voice steady but tinged with a deep sadness, "I realize that I can't pretend this didn't happen. I can't build a future on a foundation of betrayal." He pushed the papers towards her, sliding them across the smooth tabletop. "These are the divorce papers." Sarah stared at the documents, the words blurring on the page. Her world crumbled, dissolving into sharp, jagged pieces. The heavy price she was about to pay for that one moment of reckless excitement on the terrace stretched out before her, cold and unforgiving. David rose, a quiet finality in his movements. "I've already started looking for a new place." The silence that followed was the sound of a family, irrevocably broken, of a shared life ending. Sarah was left alone at the kitchen table, the legal documents a stark, unyielding reminder of her choices, and the long, solitary road of consequences that lay ahead in her quiet Midwestern life. The silence that followed David's words settled around Sarah, cold and absolute. The kitchen, once the heart of their home, now felt like a sterile courtroom. She traced the pattern on the table, the old wood grain suddenly fascinating in its intricate, indifferent detail. The stack of papers lay between them, stark white against the dark oak, a physical manifestation of a life divided. Her choices, made in a haze of champagne and a craving for something more, had brought her to this precise moment. There was no grand accusation, no heated argument, just the quiet, methodical dismantling of 12 years. The absence of drama was, in itself, a chilling drama. It was the calm before a storm that had already passed, leaving devastation in its wake. The cost of a fleeting thrill, a forgotten self, was laid bare in the form of legal documents and an empty seat at the table. She understood then that some things, once broken, could not be pieced back together. Not truly.